Today we're going to make no-knead buttermilk sweet rolls. It uses the same basic principles as the traditional no-knead bread, but it adds sugar, butter, and it replaces half of the water with buttermilk for a rich, slightly sweet, and dense texture.
The recipe uses 4 cups of flour, 4 tablespoons of butter, 2 tablespoons of sugar, 2 teaspoons of salt, a half a teaspoon of yeast, 1 cup of buttermilk plus a little bit of extra, and 1 cup of room temperature water.
We're then going to combine the dry ingredients, the sugar, salt, flour, and yeast. Mix that up. And then we're going to add our buttermilk and room temperature water. And we could use hot water and let it rise just for 2 hours, but if you let it rise for 18 hours, you actually get a more flavorful bread, more like a sourdough. Just pour that all in. Just mix it up. The butter. And you'll find that the dough is really quite wet and sticky. You can use your hands as well for this. Don't need to, just mix it up a bit. I'm going to add just a tiny little bit more buttermilk because it's a little bit dry. You can tell from the consistency. You want it quite sticky and quite wet. Sometimes, depending on the air and the temperature, you need a little more wet or less liquid. That's looking good. Okay, so just to recap, we just had 4 cups of all-purpose flour, 2 tablespoons of sugar, 2 teaspoons of salt, about a half a teaspoon of yeast, 1 cup of water, and 1 cup of buttermilk. I used a little bit more buttermilk just because the dough was a little drier than I wanted it to be. And then I added 4 tablespoons of melted butter, or 56 grams, and that looks good. And so once this is all done, we're just going to cover it with, you can use either a plain dishcloth or saran is fine. I'm going to use saran. And then we'll pick this up in about 18 hours. It is the next day. I said about 18 hours, but it's only been about 15, but the dough is nice and bubbly, and that's really all that you need. See all the bubbles come up, and it's gotten quite springy, and it's good to go. So it doesn't have to be 18 hours if it looks ready earlier. So what we're going to do is we're going to generously flour the surface here, and I'm going to transfer the dough. That's a nice texture, very sticky, you can see, and quite wet. Okay. So because we're going to make buns, this would be just a loaf. We would just form this and let it sit for a couple hours. But because we're going to make buns, I'm going to start by cutting it into 4s. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take this, we're going to stretch it and fold. We're going to do that several times, and we can keep flouring a little bit. Stretch and fold. And this is going to help create nice bubbles and air in the rolls. Okay, so we've done all of our stretching and folding. I'm just going to put a little bit more flour on here so that these buns, while they rise the next bit, they don't get stuck. And you see I've just shaped them, and what I've done is I've just folded the dough underneath, and then you get a nice ball at the top. We'll leave this for a couple of hours. Then we're going to do our final cutting and folding, and then they'll be ready to go in the oven. Okay, we're back a couple of hours later, and now we're ready for the last couple of things that we got to get set up. So we're going to immediately turn our oven on to 375. We want about 9 by 13 for these 24 buns, so we'll use that. And I'm going to put this in the oven, and I don't know if you can get in there and see the oven, but I've got a baking sheet here in the oven. Most baking uses steam and a steam oven. We don't have a steam oven here, but what I'm going to do is once that is hot, I'm going to put about a half a cup of water on that lower baking pan just to give it a little bit of steam, just to give a little bit of crispiness on the top of the rolls. With these rolls, they're buttermilk rolls, so you don't really need it, but we're going to try it that way anyway and see how that goes. Okay, so while the oven is heating up, we want it to hit its 375, and actually I'm going to turn it up to about 450. We'll turn it back to 375 when we get ready to bake, but what we want is we want that baking pan, the stove pan, to get hot so that it's nice and hot when we start baking, and that'll take about 30 or 35 minutes. So I've uncovered the dough, and you see how much it's risen and fluffed up really beautifully. And then we're going to divide these into about 24. Some more stretch and fold. The dough is nice and beautifully stretchy. Okay, now that we've done all 4 of those, stretch and fold, and you can see they've shrunk back down a little bit again, I'm going to try my best to make about 24 buns. So you'll see as you go, it does get really sticky, so you'll just want to keep making sure there's lots of flour. And you see the buns are taking shape, so make sure you got lots of flour because they get very, very sticky as you go. And then you just keep folding them under like you're filling a dumpling. Okay, so you're going to have the buns that are somewhere between around 45 to 50 grams a piece. So then we're just going to cover this up, and we're going to let the oven heat for another 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to transfer the buns into that hot baking pan. So our 30 minutes is done. These have risen up nicely a little bit more, and they're ready to go in the oven. Okay, so I've put the buns in here, so they're ready to go. So I'm going to put them in the oven in the middle tray. Before I close the door, I'm going to dump a half a cup of water onto here and close the door immediately, just to let it steam up a little bit. So we're going to set the timer for 25 minutes. While we're getting ready, we're actually going to melt just a couple of tablespoons of butter, so we can brush that on top when they're done. Melt that up and brush those on. And we'll see what they look like in 25 minutes. Okay, Maddie wants some buttermilk rolls. There we have it. They look pretty delicious to me right now. We'll see. And then I'm going to just take some butter, give them a nice coating of butter, so a nice gloss, and that butter's going to sink in as well. So just back in the oven for another 2 minutes or so, and let them cool down, and then we can taste them. And there you have it. Simple, rich, crispy, and delicious buttermilk, no knead sweet rolls.